some of you guys were with us during the last fundraising lab that we had. And we talked about, organizing galas and pivoting your fundraising to being online. So given in that vein, I brought some props to make you feel like you're actually in that event planning zone
I
mode.
love that.
But we're going to talk a little bit more, have a conversation. It's just going to be an open conversation with Vu and Michelle. They've been working really hard on actually changing the landscape on the way that we actually do fundraising in order to support the revolution that is led by our community members. But we're going to start off with Vu and Michelle introducing yourselves, saying a little bit about yourselves, what brought you to this work, and we'll start off with the woman of color, Michelle.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you. Nice. I love that. We need more of that, right? Yeah, so I came to fundraising quite by accident. I didn't know a lot about the nonprofit sector when I got in a car accident that led me to not really be able to be part of the workforce. So I chilled. This is like 2004. So I lived with my parents while my back recovered. And a friend of mine was like, "You are feeling so sorry for yourself right now. I need you to come out with me. Let's go to like a poetry reading." And I was, this was like early 2000s. I was into slam poetry still. And I met the executive director of an organization that I was convinced that was a poet and that I got convinced to do volunteer work for. So that's how I fell into fundraising, as I literally had an accident, couldn't work full time, was just in the process of recovering. And I stepped into the doors of Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, which is now the largest immigrant rights organization, legal aid organization in the nation. And at that time was 12 people and a couple of offices. And I fell right to work, being really inspired by seeing people from different cultures and communities together, and seeing people who'd grown up with privilege, people who did not, all working together to fight for the rights of immigrants and refugees. And my family are Iranian refugees. My dad's white and my mom's an Iranian refugee. They met in Iran and they fled together. So my white dad is, of course, talking about how he's a refugee. So forgive me for saying that is self-identified inappropriately, possibly. But yeah, they fled in the middle of the night in '78 during the Iranian Revolution, and we took a lot of shit for having a Muslim family in the small town, what was then the small town of Bothell, that was basically like a trailer park in between. I mean, a trailer park and in the sticks, like between two Boeing plants. That's basically what Bothell was at that time. Of course, now it's McMansions in the suburbs of Seattle. But growing up, experiencing a lot of racism and experiencing a lot of othering was difficult. And I grew into wanting to become a therapist, and then went into this fundraising journey quite by accident. And just being around people who were so inspired to work towards one movement and seeing everybody work together was exactly what got me to fall in love with fundraising. So that's how I ended up in fundraising, and Northwest Immigrant Rights Project was the beginning of that for me.
Awesome. It's an amazing organization.
Yeah.
For sure. They've changed a lot of people's lives, not just yours. But
Yeah.
we're glad they changed yours.
Yes, right? Yeah, me too. Thank you. Yeah. So that was the beginning.
Awesome. Awesome. Vu, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I was born in Vietnam and moved over here when I was 8. My father fought against the communists and he was put into re-education camp, and we moved over here through the American Homecoming Act because my older adopted half, my sister, my older sister. And I was told to become a doctor or a lawyer, preferably a combination of a doctor and a lawyer. And instead I went into social work, which made my parents very, very proud, and got into an organization called the Vietnamese Friendship Association, which was not a dating website like some people thought. We had some branding issues back then. And then founded RVC, which is a capacity building and leadership organization. And the whole, just all the past few years, I've just been I love our sector, and I also see there's a lot of challenges in our sector, and fundraising is one of those things. And I think, like Michelle, most of us fundraisers of color kind of end up in the sector by accident in a way. Probably, and we do need to talk about this, which is that fundraising has not been very responsive. It has not been attracting fundraisers of color into the field. So we should talk about it.
Yeah, well, thank
Sure.
you. And we're really, really happy to have both of you guys here. And thank you for agreeing to participate in this. Just by way of letting everybody know, I'm sure that you were expecting Cece, who is a lot, funnier and smarter than me in facilitating this conversation. But she had a family emergency and was not able to be with us. So please have some thoughts for her and her family. And really, I think Cece is the reason that has brought a lot of this work together. She's been a steadfast champion for organizations, basically leading the movement in Washington State and in Oregon. I mean, sorry, not Oregon, California. We have several grantees here from Washington and from California participating. And this conversation has basically came about before I joined the Satterberg Foundation. Juliet and Brian, Caroline, Sarah, and Cece started reaching out to partner organizations and asking them what some of their needs were, especially given the COVID time, the time of COVID. And one of the things that emerged was having some connectivity and having conversations about fundraising and shifting their fundraising about self-care and how to take care of one another during these times. So and I'm just jumping in here to moderate and have fun with the two of you through this conversation, started planning these events. And like I mentioned last time, we had the how to pivot your fundraising to be online. And now we're going to talk about, we traditionally have these galas, fundraisers, breakfasts that I don't know about you guys. I've been an executive director before of a nonprofit, and I hated gala fundraising time because we're often made to perform, right? And whether we're going to have the picture booth, or whether we're going to have a fundraiser on a shoestring to where we serve Corona very limited for expense, drinks, or whether we go all out and have the champagne barefoot bubbly. It totally depends on what our budget is, and having to make those decisions was just painful for me. I hated it. I always felt like I was begging for money to do the work that I was doing. But there are some strange folks out there that love this and are really good at it. But they recognize that it's not necessarily the best way, because often what happens, actually, I'm not going to say what happens. Michelle, why don't you tell me what your experience has been? Because you were doing this. You're one of those strange animals that is energized by finding donors and energized by planning these meals and getting out there, and not only energized, but are really good at it and working with volunteers and making the volunteers feel like they're golden, that the only reason these events took place is because, it was for them, and it truly is. But can you tell us a little bit about what your experience was in doing this and how CCF came about?
Yeah. So, maybe I'll start with how CCF came about, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Then we can get into fundraising questions like the gala, because you're right. I love raising money, and I love fundraisers. I think most of my friends are in the nonprofit sector because I see them as people who are because I'm just attracted to people who can see a vision and execute it. And fundraisers are often, and executive directors as well, are often the people who can see something up in the future, see something they could build, and then they can strategize around it and execute the strategy to actually build the thing. And we build so many amazing things, programs, connections, community. it's really incredible. So yeah, I am one of those strange people who loves fundraising, as are probably most people on this call, hopefully. But the way that CCF came about is because in my successes fundraising, and again, I was at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project for 10 years after I started volunteering there. I played every role in development there, and it grew. The organization grew quite a bit while I was there. And so, even though all of our staff were dedicated to social justice, we also knew that there were some rules that we didn't really know about that we needed to follow in order to make things happen. We definitely worked with, worked with each other around what felt good and what didn't feel good. I definitely made a lot of mistakes while I was working there. The mistake of client storytelling in a way that feels uncomfortable for everybody. I've definitely been there, and then had staff be upset and never want to talk about fundraising again, having to apologize and really understand more about storytelling. I've made all the traditional mistakes too. And I think in making those mistakes, there's always been a tension that's but I was also doing what we're supposed to be doing, and yet they were huge mistakes. Why is that? And I think the answer really came when I read, Vu and I knew each other before he started the blog, and we met at a fundraiser and immediately started talking about how messed up fundraising was. And we, touched base regularly, and I'd been reading the blog, but when he wrote that post in 2017 about how donor centrism is ultimately perpetuating white supremacy, but is also undermining our organization's mission. And then he wrote the next one about the 9 principles of community-centric fundraising. I knew he was right, and I also didn't know what to do about it because I was finding a lot of success in traditional fundraising methods. So fast forward to, I don't know, I think it was maybe 2 years later, I joined the group that was informally meeting around community-centric fundraising. We formalized, and we did a survey. The survey that was just, where the final results were just released last month in a virtual event that we did that we can link to, called Data Says, the information that BIPOC people knew that everyone else is just now waking up to. And the survey showed us, we did that, and we threw a summit for people of color in fundraising. The survey was international, with most folks actually from Canada and the US. But it showed us that all people, both white folks, people of color, queer people, however we cut the data up and disaggregated it, it showed us that people are really uncomfortable, fundraisers are really uncomfortable with the way that fundraising perpetuates systems of inequity. And we also saw that people on all parts of the spectrum really also would like to change the way that fundraising is done and are willing to do more education with their donors, are willing to partner with other nonprofits. And what we knew from our qualitative surveys is that the folks who were responding are people who are feeling really isolated, like they were the only one in their community. They might be the only one at their nonprofit, but they certainly weren't the only ones in their community. And we got to see that. When we hosted the Seattle Summit for People of Color in Fundraising, 90 people showed up. And many of us thought we'd know everybody there, and that there was no way that was possible, not even for Vu, who knows everybody. So what we learned is that there was this desperation around really wanting to connect with other people. The request was for a place to connect, a place for more resources for people of color in fundraising, and a place for resources around how to do fundraising differently. And that's why ultimately we built the Content Hub, which is communitycentricfundraising.org, so that we could actually amplify and lift up voices of people who are experimenting, trying things, who are cheerleading, who are devastated, any of those things. Just a place where there could be content that shows us part of the way forward. And yeah, Vu, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, that's good. I ditto to what Michelle said.
Vu, did you know that this was going to happen? That 9 principles of community-centric fundraising was going to get you to, or the community to, where it is now?
I think this is, again, I feel like I get a lot of credit for this, but again, this is something that lots of people have had problems with. I think lots of fundraisers of color over years have been saying these things. I do feel like it's harder for lots of people who don't have a platform like my blog to be able to say these things and be okay, you know, and not get fired. Because some of the stuff that I point out are things, again, like we have to get our donors to think about where their money came from. It can't just be us sending them a handwritten thank you note anymore when so much of their money might have come from slavery or colonization and it's time for reparation. So it can't just be this the way we've been doing is just centering on donors and specifically white donors, comforts and sense of being appreciated.
Mhm.
And so everything that we have done has been around that. And for a lot of fundraisers of color, it feels very, very icky. And I would imagine for a lot of white fundraisers too, it feels very gross. And we feel this dissonance, right? And I feel like being a fundraiser of color, I remember being in like a donor's house that had a 180-degree view of the lake or the sound, and I was just like, this is not, why am I here? This is very uncomfortable for me, right? And of course, some of that is my own experience and relationship to money, being growing up poor and stuff like that. But a lot of it is like this discomfort of going to white folks and saying, hey, can you give money to help solve some problems that you and your ancestors caused in the first place? That sort of dissonance is something that we have to address if we're going to do this effectively. Not just to do this work effectively, but to actually bring about a just and inclusive world.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. So I'm guessing that, you've often had to, or have been asked, is like, but will that scare the donors that have been giving us money for, 10, 15 years or since the organization started? And then where will we go from there?
Oh, I was working on a blog post called Shadow Missions, but how we talk about things like, oh, we need to work ourselves out of a job, but do we actually believe this? We don't. So many, and it's understandable. I have a mortgage to pay. I need to earn money to feed my families and so on. But if we really want to do what we envision as a sector, then many of us will have to be okay with putting ourselves out of business, putting our nonprofits out of business too. So we have to do that. But instead, what we have been sort of conditioned to think about what is effective to preserve our mission for as long as possible. And so we start becoming very afraid of challenging donors. So I think that one, yes, we have to be okay with giving up money, grants, on occasion donors. Some of them get offended and then they're going to leave. Actually, when we were talking about community-centric fundraising, I was invited to come to a board meeting and talk about it. And one board member, a major donor, literally emailed the ED the next day and said that was offensive, that you brought up slavery and colonization, and I can't be involved with this organization anymore. And he took away his donation and dropped the board as well. And I have never been more proud of myself. Because if we want to do this work effectively, then yes, we're going to make some people mad. And we have to. We have a bunch of donors who are sexist and racist, and we just let them off the hook because we think that it's more important to raise money than to create an inclusive and just world. And that needs to stop. But the other thing I would say is that, like, we have to challenge our own assumptions about the efficacy of doing that. Because I think sometimes when we stand on our principles, what happens in the short term, we might lose some people, but in the long run, I think we actually earn more money to be able to do the stuff we need to do.
Yeah, the sector actually, Vu, provides a safe haven for the racist donor. This is the safest place for them to operate. And that onus is essentially on us and the boards that perpetuate that.
That's right.
That's right. Thank you, Ruby. And also, I think I failed to say this at the beginning of the conversation. Is like, this is literally a conversation. It's not, it's fireside chat, from wherever it is that you are. It may be 110 degrees, so you don't have to sit by the fireside. but Vu and Michelle are open to questions or comments from all of the 64 participants that are on right now. So we'll see, we'll try to make it work. So how do we, you know, spread this movement? How do we all participate in community center fundraising? I mean, what does it take to, you know, take this moment and make it into a much larger movement?
I think we're exploring that. So one thing that, how many people, let's see, is there a way to, okay, so in this, if you click on participants in the lower part of your screen, you actually can raise your hand. And just in case you feel like engaging in this way, you don't have to. I'd love to know how many people were able to make it to our launch event for community-centric fundraising?
I can do a poll.
Ooh, that's even better.
Okay. How many people made it to the launch event?
Sure. Yeah. Because that will give us a good idea where to start. And I'm hearing, let's see here. Oh, I see. Lauren, you asked about the blog. Okay, and Vu, you put the blog post in the chat. Excellent.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'd love to know. Oh, that's awesome.
Quick.
Nice work, Rosa.
Thank you. Learned all new sets of skills during COVID time.
That is so true. That is so true.
It looks like we have pretty much everybody that's answered.
Okay.
You have 8 people that made it to the launch.
Okay, cool. So then we'll start.
Let me do another follow-up question with this poll. Is how many people hold on. I guess I don't have all new sets of skills because I can't figure out how to do a new one.
That was pretty amazing though.
Uh-huh. Basically where you're sitting right now in Washington or California.
Oh, awesome. So when we launched communitycentricfundraising.org, we knew that it would be big. Also, I mean, as Vu has obvious high visibility in the community, and I'd been working with Edgar Villanueva last year and saw that, you know, how his visibility grew really quickly in the community as well. We knew that there was a thirst, and our surveys had told us that there was a thirst for more information about how we should do, you know, more information about criticisms of the sector and more information about how we might connect with one another and how we can do things differently, how we have those difficult conversations with board members or staff members or our colleagues, you know, or like, you know, how we stop white women from gatekeeping, how we deal with microaggressions, like the variety of questions that were, thank you for doing that, a variety of questions. We knew that there was a thirst. What we didn't necessarily expect when we launched is that we threw this virtual launch event. We're an all-volunteer group. We've hired some capacity for like editorial guide, you know, creating the website, etc. Having an editor work with people who want to submit pieces. By the way, please feel free to submit a piece to the Content Hub. We do have an editor waiting to work with you. And we didn't expect that there would be nearly 3,000 people on that virtual launch call. It was a virtual launch on Zoom. It's recorded, it's on our website, but 2,800 people showed up to that. And in a matter of 2 weeks, we had nearly 10,000 people on our mailing list from zero. And so even though this group started in Seattle, I mean, this particular iteration of this particular group doing community-centric fundraising, okay, most people are in Washington, got it. And 33% in California. Thank you, Rosa.
You're welcome.
We knew that there was a thirst everywhere. And what we found is that there's actually a huge thirst all over the world. We had participants from all over the world. We have participants from all over the world on our mailing list. And we are learning how, we're an organization that's not really an organization. We're trying to be a movement. So we're not an actual nonprofit. We do have an umbrella so that we can accept money in that way. But we're trying to figure out the mechanisms by which we knew that this content hub would be our goal as Seattle CCF, a chapter or an affinity group. But we're now considering how we might expand out. And we're holding an event around that on Thursday. Vu, I don't know if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah, we want this to be a movement, so we don't want to control this. I think we've been very inspired by Black Lives Matter and how we want people to be able to take this and explore and try things and fail and learn some lessons. And as Michelle said, there's definitely a hunger and dissatisfaction with the way that donor-centered fundraising has been used in our sector. So the movement it can be a little nebulous. So here's a bunch of lesson. Here's a list of all the stuff, a few things that we want to you can start doing. So based on the principles that we have, for example, one of the principles is ending the nonprofit Hunger Games, right? And people are starting to do more things. Like I think it was Arts Corps one year who for Give Big actually sent out an email blast saying, hey, we really appreciate your donation, but please also donate to our partner organizations. Here's 5 of them. And it was really inspiring to see people looking out for one another. I know Group Health gave $50,000 to nonprofits at the beginning of the pandemic. And some nonprofits actually declined that money and actually said, can you give it to these other organizations instead on the front line? So that's an example of us lifting up one another. Some other examples is being able to decenter the sort of the major donors. What we do is we value people and money. So that's why we have major donors, right? And we recognize them first in our annual reports. Here's the $10,000 donor, here's the $5,000 donor. Here's the garbage people who only gave $10, right? And that is not a good way for us to think about this. So we have to so what we can do is just like get rid of all those levels altogether and just list people by their name, by alphabetical order. That way everyone is right. And a $10 donor for a student or someone who's unemployed, that is a major gift and it's significant, and it should be just as appreciated as a millionaire who gave $1,000. But we don't appreciate that because we appreciate money the most. So there are certain things on that list that you can do. Michelle also mentioned like not sort of do this poverty tourism thing, where we have like usually people of color telling a very tragic, painful story in front of a room full of white people. That needs to end. Right? That's sort of like, sure, it raised money, but I don't think the movement challenges the effectiveness of donor centrism. We know it works, but just because something works doesn't mean that it is the right or the ethical things to do, right? So no, the argument that this works is not good enough anymore. Is it ethical is what we have to start asking ourselves.
Yeah.
It always floored me going to events where, they're working on, let's say, homelessness, and they're serving caviar and all these fancy foods and champagne, to make all of these rich people feel good about how opulent they are being. And in order for them to release a little bit of cash for somebody that's living on the streets and doesn't have access to the resources that they have. So it's so counterintuitive in the way the fundraising has been going on, is like catering to the rich in order to give crumbs to the poor.
Yes, so that's another thing. Taxes, right? Yes, we can thank people, but we know that that like higher wealth individuals pay a lower proportion of taxes, relatively than people who are lower income. And so we ourselves perpetuate that by just kind of reaffirming them and treating them as heroes, right? We're not anti-donors by any means. Most of us in this room are donors in some level, right? We like donors, but we also need to work with them differently. I kind of see, this is probably one of the most controversial things that I say about community-centric fundraising, but I kind of think of donor-centered fundraising like, I don't know, like husband-centered marriages. Like I'm a husband, I would love it if my partner goes around every single time I wash the dishes, she'll write a thank you note that says, "Dear Vu, thank you for doing the dishes. Because of you, our family is stronger and our community is better off because you did the dishes. You are a hero." Yes, I would love that. And I am sure that if I get a note like that every single time I do something that is my duties around the house, then yeah, I would be more likely to do that. I'll be happier too. But is that what we want? No. As in this marriage, I have a responsibility to my family and I need to do what I'm supposed to do. I need to do my part, whether or not I'm thanked for it. But we don't treat our donors like that. So we're just out there, just reaffirming terrible things.
And one thing that I think is interesting, I wrote an article. The only article I've written is on the CCF website, and it's about the power that we have as fundraisers. But I extend that because one of the other ways in which it shows up, right, we'll have these fancy dinners around homelessness, serving caviar to our donors or our potential donors, and we'll turn around and we'll accept shit for salaries, right? We'll allow ourselves to be paid poorly, because we're serving a population of people who doesn't have access. So we also doesn't have access, like for example, at that same organization serving unhoused people, right? The staff will maybe be paid really poorly as well. And there are so many dynamics like that we can explore around power and privilege, and also how money is used in our nonprofits and what our emotional issues are around those pieces, because we are actually often within our nonprofits, we may not have created the systems, but we are often upholding them by the way that we allow, like Ruby was saying, we allow people to hide in these very safe structures we've built, and we just keep perpetuating them on ourselves as well.
So what are the steps? How do we do this? How can we join?
Go ahead, Vu.
Well, I think what's really exciting about this is as a movement, you can join whatever way you want, right? Some organizations I think one organization here in Seattle mailed out a copy of Ijeoma Uluo's book, So You Want to Talk About Race, to their major donors and had a book club meeting with the major donors. Of course, it freaked out some of the major donors. They're like, why are you asking me to talk about race? Why? But for some other donors, they're like, whoa, this is great. No one's invited us to talk about this before. So they were really happy that they got this invitation. I do think that we have been kind of babying our donors. We say things like, let's not treat our donors like ATMs. But the reality is we treat our donors like ATM. We're just very nice to our ATMs. We give our ATMs a cookie, for giving out money. Like that's not like a strong relationship. If we want this to work, then we need to actually have these conversations with donors and be okay with pushing them and saying, hey, what you said was actually racist and we respect you enough to give you this feedback right now, right? So you can do that. You can also work on partnering with another organization to helping them lift them up. Also, I think it's important to just understand not just what we're willing to do, but what we are willing to not do, to refrain from doing. Mm-hmm. So that means for example, not applying for a grant, or to lift up another organization when they are applying for a grant, or calling up a funder and saying, hey, this is really great, but it seems like you're missing these other organizations. Can you go and can you help them? And maybe even supporting these smaller organizations with their own grant writing. These are blasphemous ideas because we have been taught that our mission is the most important thing. And I really want us to get out of that mindset. Our mission is not the most important thing. Our community is the most important thing. And that means that our missions have to work together and not be in competition with one another, because that does not serve our community at all.
Yeah, I think, we talk about how we need to be treating individual donors differently, but also I think we need to be taking the risk to speak to foundations honestly as well, and foundation staff. One of the folks who gave us funding for this project said, made this comment and said, I've noticed that many program officers at foundations were the most radical activists in their communities. And then they became neutralized when they became program officers at foundations. right? And we've seen it, right? We've seen it. And we know why that happens. And it's heartbreaking for our communities too. Sometimes it's great, and a lot of times it's awful. But we need to have those conversations with foundations too. Vu, along with two other folks, wrote a book called Unicorns Unite, which I used last year in facilitating some conversations with a foundation who was having a lot of trouble building new relationships with their grantees and trying to do it differently. And that book actually provides guidelines as to how we might have how we might envision relationships differently with foundations too. But to the bigger question of how do we jump in, how do we get started, the 10 principles of community-centric fundraising are a good starting point. It would be so difficult to follow all of them for any nonprofit. And so obviously, like, this is a very aspirational movement. But the more we try, the more honest we have to be with each other, the more we have to work in collaboration with each other as nonprofits, each other as in funder relationships with different entities that fund us, differently in relationship with ourselves, and being honest with how much power we hold. I have a podcast called The Ethical Rainmaker. That's part of the flow of the communications coming from communitycentricfundraising.org. And in my third episode that comes out next week, I'm interviewing Fleur Larson. And one thing, she's a white woman who's a DEI facilitator, and she talks about white women as gatekeepers and all the things that come along with that. But one thing she said that I didn't realize explicitly is she talked about how us not understanding the power that we have is not just the stuff that some of us, especially people of color, have about imposter syndrome, right? It's also part of white supremacy. It's also part of like the mechanisms that are used to hide and say, like, I don't have that power. Sorry, somebody else does, right? And we forget or disempower ourselves. We have a lot of encouragement from society, to do that, to operate that way, and from capitalism and from patriarchy to operate that way. But I think taking a look at those 10 principles and really understanding our power in changing the narratives, and also our shared collective power when we all stand together in upholding some of these ways of doing things, new ways of doing things.
Yeah, there's a great question that came in the chat box, and it reminds me, it's a very, well, it's actually not a very thin line, but the lines are often blurred between educating and manipulating. So how do you tell a story to educate people and to get donors, whether it's a community-centric donor or very large, wealthy donor, to tell the story in a way that they're gonna get it.
Yeah, I don't think we're saying don't tell stories. I think we just want to be thoughtful about how we tell people stories. Also, are we allowing them the agency to tell their story? Mm-hmm. Are they informed about what is happening? Because oftentimes they trust us, and that's the thing, is they trust us, and we don't tell them, actually, you're going to be in front of several hundred people who will have information about you, and it will be an asymmetrical, information sharing. And are you going to be okay with that, right? Also, we don't compensate them. So that's another thing, is being sure that we compensate people for sharing their time and their stories. What I see happen is that we bring someone up onto the stage to tell their painful story in front of a bunch of white folks, and then they're escorted out. They may not even have a seat at the gala table, or they put in the back or something, right? It's just really gross. So it's not, don't tell stories, just do it thoughtfully and with consent and agency and compensation.
And the other part of that question is, how do you get access to, these caviar eating listservs? There are a lot of community organizations out there that specifically working with the incarcerated, that can't even get somebody to answer their phone call to focus on these communities that are often left out of the table, of the room in general, when it comes to, fundraising and getting resources for, to serve their community.
That's right. That's a good question. Vu wrote this article that I'm still having lots of feelings about, and around empathy.
Feelings are good. That means you're
Feelings are
human.
good. Feelings are great. Because we've relied on empathy for so long, right? We've relied on this idea that, like, if you could just put yourself in someone else's shoes and let's paint a picture for you. And that's not always going to work. I mean, that's not always going to work. And so how do we bring in people who have wealth into these issues? I mean, right now I'm experimenting, right? There are no experts in community-centric fundraising. Maybe there are, I don't know them. They're not part of the Seattle CCF group. But in my consultancy, we're experimenting with different ways to be more community-centered. And what does that mean? What is the role of wealthy white folks, you know, eating caviar? At the table, like, if any, and how does that money come? So there's an article from Hilary Giovanni, who I linked to, that came out this week about reparations and her vision about reparations and her dues to the community because of the way that her ancestors made their money and what repair can look like. So I think reparations is part of that picture, but I think there are some missing links still about how we invite those folks and if we invite those folks. And, you know, I hear the, like, how do we get them involved? And there isn't necessarily a straight answer on that, because a lot of our nonprofits also, just today I had a conversation with a potential client, and they were saying, like, our staff are all people of color. Everybody grew up without a lot of money resources. And therefore, like, this organization that's in the STEM or tech STEM arena doesn't have, like, the trust fund to get it started, or, like, the wealthy, you know, parent who can give them a boost. And a lot of our organizations are founded by or have a lot of staff who have a lot of access to wealth that kind of help keep us going. So, Vu, you're the one that wrote the article about empathy.
Yeah, but I think this time it's really about, so going back to the empathy thing, we have been using empathy a lot. And I think we have to move towards justice, which is like getting donors, whether or not they can empathize with someone is great, but it should not be this sort of gate towards justice for folks, right? I will never be able to empathize with being like a Black trans woman. Does not mean that I should not be supporting the liberation of Black trans women. Right? It should not be dependent on whether I can empathize or not. And unfortunately, we have been sort of situating this where we don't expect things to happen unless we get rich people to empathize, you know, with the plight of the marginalized. And I think that is just not the frame that our sector should be continuing any further. But regarding access, I don't know. I think it's still, we're kind of stuck in this, like, if we can just get these major donors who are eating caviar, then they're going to save things and they're going to help us and save. It's like, no, in some ways, why do they even have that much wealth in the first place? They should be paying taxes. Why does Amazon give $100 million to homelessness? And then we're like, oh, Amazon is so amazing, when they should be paying billions of dollars in taxes. So it's the same on every single level here, is that we have to start changing the status quo, and we got to start shifting systems. We really got to challenge capitalism and the tax codes that we have, so that we have donors who don't have that much money for us to be out there, you know, like trying to get at them to pay attention to these issues that they're part of the cause of.
Yeah. So, you know, there's a couple of things that both of you guys said, you know, talking about justice and not necessarily empathy, and having that be the focus. And Michelle, you mentioned that, you know, there's the organization that has all these people of color and they don't necessarily have the trust fund, but some people do give because they start talking about how these people have grit. And there's been a lot of conversations going around about having grit, and it grinds on me because it does. It's like, I have grit, you have grit, everybody in this call has grit, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't have any help or support from their community, right? Yeah. So moving away from empathy, moving away from holding the individual as the sole, you know, person responsible for their life's trajectory. So it brings us back to what you guys are talking about, right? Community, and how as a community, we need to focus on the community. We're not working towards mission, we're working towards our community. That's our responsibility.
Right.
And speaking about community and funding is me as a program officer, not just at Satterberg, or any other organization that I work for, I'm a gatekeeper. It's like, what do I need to do to be a part of this movement? How can I help? How can other program officers, I mean, because we live in this, Michelle, you mentioned Edgar Villanueva. He talks a lot about decolonizing wealth, and specifically from the foundation side.
Yeah.
So what are some, and you traveled around the country with him in his tour. What are some of the lessons or the things that you can impart, and not for my sake necessarily? I mean, there's a lot that I can learn, but in some of our organizations that are here, how they can approach other program officers and ask, you know, for them to not be gatekeepers, but be partners in this movement.
Right. Well, I think that there are a few ways to think about it. As gatekeepers, anyone who is a gatekeeper must think about themselves that way, right? And so self-awareness actually becomes part of the issue, because when we are aware that we are holding power, like, we have to check ourselves and come up with mechanisms that seem like that are accountable. Again, from this interview that I just did the other day, the example of this facilitator, she is accountable to multiple people of color. And when she does work, she actually does a 40-60 split, where she does 60% of the work for 40% of the pay. And that is all about her as a DEI consultant respecting her colleagues, wanting to make sure that she is in line with the people of color in her life. She partners mostly with women of color who are accountability partners, who she pays to do that work, to make sure that the work that she's doing is centered where it should be, right? Because she is trying to be a tool for change and for equity. And there's a lot that we can do with, you know, great white allyship like that. And so, you know, in that conversation, one of the things I gleaned was really that self-awareness piece for any gatekeeper of, like, how is my power wielded? Who am I in a relationship with? Does that need to change? Do I need to look for some of the things that aren't really obvious, you know, coming up? Because a program officer might ask, like, is everything okay? But I think when you actually develop real relationships with people and are able to have honest conversations, like the way that we got that Vu and I got welcomed to this call today in the green room was by being told by Julia and Rosa that we could just be our full selves, right? Like, we could just casual conversation, show up as your full self. This is not like other places. And I think, you know, that might speak to the culture of Satterberg. And certainly I think we need to work towards places like that where we are really cognizant of the power that we're holding when we're gatekeeping. When we are in a position where we need that gatekeeper to open those gates, and they don't have that self-awareness, and there aren't mechanisms for feedback, honest feedback, that's problematic. One of the suggestions is that I've heard is to approach the gatekeeper with multiple people, right? So that it's like not a one-on-one conversation. It's about, like, help open the gate for many of us, or do you know that you hold this kind of power? Here's how you can do it differently. I was part of a cohort recently where we learned that one group of people had their one organization, one nonprofit that was doing great change-making work and leadership development work, got all of their funding pulled so that a new darling could get funded instead by this foundation. And when we discovered that in conversation earlier this year, we decided that those two people from each of those foundations needed to go talk to that program officer about the impact that had and the choices that were made. What happened when you pulled funding from my organization and gave it to this organization that's your new darling? Like, what happened in our community as a result? Here's the impact. With the blessing and the allyship of the organization who received the money, saying, we didn't know, we may not have actually even done our homework, around why we got this money and where it came from, because we trusted you Foundation, that you were in right relationship with your, grantees. And so having that difficult conversation is really important, is rare, right? It's not happening a lot, but I'd love to see that happening more when we're talking about gatekeeping.
Okay. Does the audience have any other questions that you'd like to ask, or props for Michelle or Vu? Vu, what does the AF stand for?
And fearless, nonprofit and fearless.
I thought it was something else.
It could be whatever you want it to be, Rosa.
I thought it was nonprofit as expletive.
As fun? Yeah, of course.
Is it possible to ask a question?
Yes.
One of the things that what this makes me think of is sort of the education piece around, like, how do you actually become an effective fundraiser? And I would say I'm still relatively new to the field. I've only been doing it for 4 years, but I was able to get 2 years at a very large, at the Opera, and then I'm doing my current 2 at CD Forum, so 2 very drastically different organizations, different missions, still in the arts. And I realized that, like, a lot of the things that I learn as sort of best practice may be upholding those sort of, white supremacist standards that we are just like handed down as, like, this is how you're supposed to do fundraising. This is how you're, like, from the acknowledgement process to the, like, how you manage your database. So I was wondering, has CCF thought about or will be looking into that sort of, like, because right now my only sources are AFP, like, when it comes to, like, and my own individual work with mentorship and things like that. And I haven't looked for a mentor in AFP because the chances of me finding, like, a person of color as a mentor is real slim. So I'm curious if you all are thinking about that sort of component, about, because I feel like that's equally as important. If you are not educating people to do fundraising in this way, none of the work is going to happen.
Absolutely.
That's right.
And my apologies. I do have to run off as soon as this comment is done. Yeah, this is why we started this movement, because so much of the practices and the philosophies behind them have been very grounded in best practices. And usually when we say best practices, what we mean is white practices, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But it only works for certain people in certain situations, and we have to stop using it as a default. So, but we also don't really know, because we haven't been given permission to try different things. So CCF is about giving folks permission to try, to fail, to explore, to write about it. So we would love your help, Nina, on this. And another thing that we're trying to do is, as we go and explore, we got funding from Satterberg and other funders to actually pay people. So if you're exploring this, you want to write something about that, we got funding to pay you $250 a piece on it, so that we don't have unpaid labor while we're doing this movement work. So I would say explore and write about it. And this is the exciting work that's coming forward, and I'm really excited about it, and I hope that you all are too. And my apologies, everyone. I got to run to the next Zoom meeting. But I really appreciate you all, and I hope we have another conversation soon.
Thank you, Vu. Michelle, you still have a couple minutes?
Yeah,
Thank you,
sure.
Vu. We'll be in touch. And by the
He just bounced.
and I was gonna say, I don't know him.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna just make a quick comment about this AFP thing. Okay, totally real, Nina, totally real. I have been so frustrated with AFP and their lack of listening, at least in our chapters, especially when as I was coming up as a fundraiser from the very beginning, as a volunteer at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, just trying to learn and not being able to find the mentorship. And not being able to find resonance. Of course, you would look in a grants database and you would type the word immigrant in, and there would be nothing at that time, because it wasn't, like, popular yet, And so, yeah, I did not receive a lot of support from AFP when I was coming up. And the last couple of years, I've sat on their committee for the big event that they do every year. to try to understand better what is happening in there. And I think what is happening in there is that there are a lot of white people running AFP. I think the boards are always white. I think the volunteers are often white. And I think that, you know, one chapter I talked to, as a result of the visibility that community-centric fundraising is getting, we're getting a lot of requests for speaking engagements and for collaborations. And we're like 8 people in Seattle who volunteer. So we're like, we hope this thing can grow really quickly because we need people all over the country that can do this. You know, we'd like to like soon the St. Louis chapter will be featured on our event on Thursday, you know, because they're like, we don't need to wait for these people to get their shit together. Like, we're just going to start a chapter now, which is kind of what we're also hoping will happen. But I talked to this group in New Mexico the other day, 2 women who are working with AFP. One is the board president, I think. The other one writes their newsletter. And they were talking about the fact that they're having serious conversations around how they do things in an equitable way. And they're changing all of their programming, and they're making all of their programming accessible, which is another problem. Paywalls are a horrible problem. So it's been really interesting to hear that there's at least one AFP chapter that is actually talking about it and has been doing active anti-racist work and anti-Blackness work themselves for the last 2 years. And it's been fun to hear, you know, that work is actually happening somewhere in an AFP somewhere, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you,
it's
Michelle.
going to be excuse me, Rosa.
Oh, go ahead.
It's going to be a very challenging message for AFP to hear, because they are so ingrained in the donor-centric process and the system. I mean, it literally is an infrastructure and system of the organization. I have been a chapter president in 3 different states. And so, you know, I did this work for 38 years, and AFP, you know, was my, you know, that's what I came from. But I left it because I worked for 20 of those years on diversity and equity in the organization, and they could not get it. They would not get it. They could not get it.
That's right.
And so what I hope happens with this work is that it doesn't go to chapters, and that it becomes a network. And it's a network that people can, you know, move in and out of to learn and to share information, because networks are the most powerful thing, not chapters. So that's my only thing. And I'm so excited to see this happening in this way, and appreciative of Satterberg bringing us all together like this. It's awesome.
Yeah, we're appreciative of Satterberg too. They gave us the funding that allowed us to build a website. Satterberg and Group Health Foundation and a private donor all gave to create this pool of money that's allowing us to pay all of our content contributors. Ruby, that's you. If you'd like to write or create a podcast or make a video or just anything at all about those experiences, I think that would be super valuable to everybody who's waiting and thirsty for that kind of information. And yeah, the chapter versus network, we started by calling them chapters, and we're realizing that's probably not going to be effective. And we're open. We as the Seattle group that started this this content hub and with VU in it, don't want to actually control how that all gets released, which is what part of our Thursday event is about, is really listening to the people who are engaged and have engaged in our mailing list, and listening to what it is that they want to be provided, if anything. But yeah, you won't see rules about how members need to engage or membership fees or anything like that. We are really hoping to build a network. I think that is the end goal. So,
and Michelle, did you share that link on the chat for people that want to participate on Thursday? And I recognize that we're over time, and I want to be, you know, respectful of people's times on here.
Right.
And thank everybody for being here. We have another event. Juliet put the information in the chat coming up, and it's going to be basically a happy hour for development staff and people, whoever wants to join. Michelle, you're welcome to join us. It's going to take place September 16th at 4 p.m. Happy hour, where it's just going to be a conversation among the participants. Juliet can provide a little bit more information as far as join us. And, you know, I really want to say thank you. You just thanked Satterberg, but I think Satterberg needs to really turn around and thank you guys, because it's like I said, I've been an executive director before, and fundraising is my Achilles heel. I really don't like it. And it is incredibly hard work, and it's emotional work. And I am eternally grateful, because without you, the revolution would not be funded. Uh, and we would not be, where we are now in our ability to advocate for our community. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you,
Yeah.
thank you for all the work that you do and that you
Yeah.
continue to do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Thanks for being my friend, Rosa.
Yeah.
Yeah, so glad to so thank you for all of that acknowledgement. It really means a lot. And I'll send the link. I can't find it anywhere. I'll send the link to our Thursday event to Juliet and Rosa to send to the whole list, if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, and you can follow us on social media and learn more too, but community-centric fundraising. Thanks, y'all, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And
Yeah.
thank you, everybody. If you think of other things that you think that we should be organizing, don't hesitate to let us know. You can email me or Juliet or anybody else that is in at the Satterberg Foundation that you have connections with. Have a wonderful day, and go community.
Go community. Thank you. That's so great.